The research vessel Photoween drifted silently in orbit around Narphex VII, its solar sails catching the pale, wan light of a distant, dying star. Inside its sterile confines, Jorlik Frent worked in frustrated solitude. The renowned xenobotanist was deep in his element, which meant he was frowning intensely at the lifeless samples spread across his workstation. The sterility of the samples mirrored the sterility of the planet below, a world whose death felt like an indictment of his own abilities. Narphex VII, once a jewel of botanical abundance, was now little more than a dust-coated husk. For untold millennia, its soil had lain dormant, its air choked with toxic fumes, and its waters evaporated or locked deep underground. Jorlik's sensitive antennae quivered as he studied his data. Every scan, every test, every hope had returned the same verdict. Narphex VII was dead. For Jorlik, this was not just a scientific failure. It was personal. As a Blimethan, a species renowned for their plant-like physiology and intrinsic bond with ecosystems, he felt the loss like a limb severed. His bark-textured skin had grown pale and dry during his stay here, reflecting the lifelessness of the planet. To fail to resurrect Narphex VII felt like failing a member of his own family. He let out a heavy sigh, his leafy fronds drooping as he muttered to himself. The spores are inert, the soil is as nutrient-rich as a rock, and even microbial life is absent. This is pointless. A chime interrupted his brooding, and he bristled. The holographic comm screen blinked to life, and a human face materialized, grinning with a confidence that Jorlik found both perplexing and infuriating. "Dr. Frent, how's it going?" Callan Greaves's voice was far too casual for someone who had just barged uninvited into a private workspace. "Mr. Greaves," Jorlik said, folding his arms. His tone was as stiff as the bark-like plates on his skin. "This is a secured communication channel for mission-critical updates only. To what do I owe this interruption?" Callan's grin widened, as if Jorlik's irritation was merely encouragement. "Relax, Doc. I thought you might need a fresh perspective. You've been up here for weeks, running tests and getting nowhere." "I am the foremost xenobotanist of the Blimethan Collective," Jorlik snapped. "I do not require a fresh perspective, least of all from a human with no botanical credentials." "Sure," Callan said, unbothered. "But hear me out. Maybe the problem isn't the planet, maybe it's how you were approaching it?" Jorlik blinked. His antennae twitched in disbelief. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that I, an expert with centuries of experience, am approaching it wrong?" Callan leaned closer to the camera, his blue eyes alight with mischievous energy. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Doc. See, humans have this thing called jump-starting. When something's on its last legs, we give it a good, messy kick and see if it roars back to life. Worked for a few places back on Earth. Why not here?" Jorlik's fronds stiffened. "This is not a failing combustion engine, Mr. Greaves. This is an entire planetary biosphere. The soil is inert, the atmosphere is corrosive, and even the microbial layers are dead. What precisely do you think you can kick into life?" "Everything," Callan said simply. "But first, you've got to trust me." Jorlik stared at him for a long moment, his bark-like skin darkening with agitation. Humans were infamous among the Blimethans for their chaotic biological systems and their propensity for rash decisions. Still, the collective scientific community grudgingly acknowledged humanity's ability to thrive in conditions that defied logic. "Very well," Jorlik said at last. "If only to demonstrate the futility of your reckless approach, you may proceed, but I will hold you personally accountable for any further degradation to Narphex VII." Callan's grin widened. "Deal. I'll get my gear ready." Jorlik sighed and cut the connection. He had no illusions about this human's proposed methods. At best, they would achieve nothing. At worst, they would turn the planet into an even more irreparable mess. Still, the mission was already a failure. What harm could one more absurd attempt do? 2 days later, Yorlik descended to the surface of Narphex VII to meet Callan. He stepped off the shuttle and onto the powdery gray soil, which crumbled like ash beneath his clawed feet. The air was harsh and metallic, burning faintly in his respiratory filters. In stark contrast, Callan bounded from his own lander with an energy that seemed entirely out of place on a dead world. The human carried an armful of equipment that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard rather than a scientific mission. "Here we go," Callan said cheerfully, setting down a bulky contraption that resembled a mishmash of pipes, pumps, and flashing lights. "This baby's a biodiversity catalyst rig." Jorlik eyed the device with deep suspicion. "It looks like it was assembled by an untrained apprentice." The VCR crackled to life, igniting the inside plug-out circuits. "Don't judge a book by its cover," Callan replied. "This thing's gonna be the spark that wakes this place up. But first, we need to prep the soil." Jorlik folded his arms. "The soil is inert. Preparing it would take centuries of nutrient restoration." "Not with this," Callan said, holding up a small vial filled with a luminous green liquid. "Bio-enhanced mycorrhizal fungi. Supercharged it myself. Once we plant it, the fungi will spread and start fixing the soil." Jorlik stared at the vial, appalled. "You cannot simply dump foreign organisms into an ecosystem and expect results. The environmental repercussions will be awesome," Callan finished for him. "Trust me, Doc, you'll thank me later. Now, grab a spade and help me dig." Against every instinct, Yorlik helped Callan plant the fungi. They dug small holes in the dusty soil, into which Callan poured his glowing concoction. Once the last vial was emptied, he activated the catalyst rig. It began to hum and whir, emitting a faint rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the ground. "What now?" Jorlik asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Now," Callan said, wiping his hands on his pants, "we wait." Hours turned into days, and to Yorlik's astonishment, the soil began to change. The ashen-gray substrate darkened to a rich, fertile brown. Tiny green shoots appeared, their vibrant color a shocking contrast to the barren landscape. Jorlik knelt by one of the sprouts, his fronds trembling. This is impossible. These plants are native to Narphex VII. They should have gone extinct millennia ago." "Nature's tricky like that," Callan said, leaning against the humming catalyst rig. "Those fungi woke up dormant seeds buried in the soil. Backup plans, Doc. Every ecosystem has them." "But the atmospheric toxicity," Jorlik began, struggling to process what he was seeing. We'll fix itself once we've got enough plants pumping out oxygen," Callan said confidently. "Now, let's see about scaling this up. We've got an atmosphere to fix." Jorlik stared at him, equal parts horrified and fascinated. Against all odds, Callan Greaves's unorthodox methods were working. "Very well," Jorlik said at last. "But if this spirals out of control, I will see to it that your reckless meddling is recorded in the annals of galactic history." Callan grinned. "Deal. Let's make history, Doc." Days turned into weeks, and the transformation of Narphex VII was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as scattered green shoots had exploded into a patchwork of grasses, shrubs, and small trees. The soil, once as lifeless as stone, teemed with microorganisms, their presence accelerating the nutrient cycle. Life was spreading across the planet. Despite the progress, Jorlik remained uneasy. He had analyzed the growth patterns, and the data suggested the ecosystem was developing too quickly. Entire patches of land were going from barren to forested in a matter of weeks. It was as if the planet itself were rushing to catch up with some unseen timetable. "This is reckless," Jorlik said one afternoon, standing on a rise that overlooked a rapidly greening valley. "Ecosystems are delicate, interdependent systems. If you accelerate one aspect without consideration for the others, the entire balance could collapse." Callan, lounging nearby with his hands behind his head, gave a lazy shrug. "Or it could stabilize. Nature's good at that." "Nature is not some whimsical force that you can rely upon to fix your mistakes," Jorlik snapped. "It is a system governed by principles of equilibrium and resilience. Principles that you continually ignore." Callan sat up, brushing a few leaves off his shirt. "Relax, Doc. Look around. This place is alive again. That's not a mistake. That's progress." Jorlik groaned, his antenna quivering with frustration. "Progress without understanding is folly. We are meddling with forces we barely comprehend." Callan stood and stretched, grinning. "That's the thing about humans, Doc. We're pretty good at messing with stuff and figuring it out as we go. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some pollinators to introduce." "Pollinators?" Jorlik echoed, horrified. "You're bringing in insects?" "Relax," Callan said, waving a hand. "Not just any insects. These are engineered to target specific plants. Plus, they've got built-in fail-safes to prevent overbreeding. Trust me, this place is going to buzz with life in no time." By the end of the month, Narphex VII's landscape had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. Pollinators darted through the air, flitting between flowers that had bloomed seemingly overnight. Trees, once no taller than saplings, now formed dense canopies that shaded the ground. Even the rivers, reawakened by the reactivation of ancient aquifers, were alive with fish and aquatic plants. To Jorlik's astonishment and grudging admiration, Callan's pollinator program was working. The insects played a critical role in maintaining the balance between flowering plants and their nutrient cycles. The planet's oxygen levels had risen significantly, and the atmosphere, though not yet perfect, was becoming breathable. Still, Jorlik could not shake his unease. Every success seemed to beget new complications. The first major complication came in the form of invasive vines. One morning, Jorlik discovered that an entire section of forest had been overrun by a fast-growing plant species. The vines twisted around tree trunks, strangling their branches and choking out smaller flora on the forest floor. "This is what I feared," Jorlik said, examining a sample of the vine under his microscope. "This species is not native to Narphex VII. It must have come from one of the seeds you introduced." Callan crouched beside him, plucking a strand of the vine and giving it a curious sniff. "Huh? Looks like it's thriving." "Thriving?" Jorlik exclaimed, his fronds flaring in indignation. "It is an ecological disaster. These vines are outcompeting native flora, which will destabilize the nutrient cycles. If left unchecked, they could undo everything we have accomplished." Callan scratched his chin thoughtfully. "All right, fair point, but don't worry. I've got a plan." Jorlik groaned. "Every time you say that, I find myself bracing for catastrophe. What is your plan this time?" "Herbivores," Callan said simply. "Herbivores." "Big ones," Callan said, grinning. "If these vines are such a problem, we just need something hungry enough to keep them in check. Give me a few days. I've got just the thing." True to his word, Callan's solution arrived in the form of a herd of large, gentle grazers. The creatures resembled a cross between an earth bison and a reptilian sauropod, their massive bodies covered in scales that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. They moved through the forest in slow, deliberate waves, their broad mouths stripping the invasive vines with mechanical efficiency. Jorlik watched the grazers from a safe distance, his antennae twitching. They are effective, I will grant you that, but introducing a species of this size to a developing ecosystem is a dangerous gamble. That's why we gave them population controls, Callan said, tapping a control pad on his wrist. Built-in fertility suppression. If their numbers get too high, we can dial them back. No big deal. Jorlik stared at him, his fronds wilting in exasperation. You treat ecosystems as though they are puzzles you can solve with brute force. Every time you introduce a new variable, you risk destabilizing the entire system. And every time, we've made it work, Callan countered. Look, Doc, I get that this isn't how you do things, but sometimes you've got to roll the dice to make something amazing happen. Jorlik didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the grazers, watching as they moved methodically through the forest. Despite his reservations, he had to admit the creatures were a marvel of design, precisely engineered to address the problem at hand. The weeks that followed were some of the most productive of yet. The grazers successfully controlled the invasive vines, allowing native flora to reclaim lost ground. Meanwhile, the forests continued to expand, and the rivers teemed with life. Birds nested in the canopy, and small mammals undergoing animal immunity, introduced from carefully managed earth populations, scurried across the forest floor. For the first time, Jorlik began to feel a flicker of hope. Against all odds, the ecosystem of Narphex VII was beginning to achieve balance. Remarkable, Jorlik admitted one evening as he and Callan stood on a ridge overlooking a verdant valley. Despite my doubts, this planet is beginning to resemble its former glory. Told you we'd get there, Callan said, grinning. Sometimes you just gotta have a little faith. Faith? Jorlik echoed, his fronds twitching. That is not a concept I am accustomed to applying to scientific endeavors. Callan shrugged. Works for us humans. You should try it sometime. As Jorlik gazed out at the thriving landscape, he couldn't help but wonder if Callan's reckless optimism might have been the missing ingredient all along. For a time, it seemed that Narphex VII's recovery was on a trajectory toward miraculous success. The planet's oxygen levels rose steadily, its once scorched surface now hosting dense forests, sprawling meadows, and glimmering wetlands. Even Jorlik, despite his constant vigilance, found moments of peace as he observed the flourishing life around him. But ecosystems are rarely content to grow quietly. The delicate balance Callan had championed was still forming, and like a precarious sculpture, it was prone to unexpected shifts. The first storm hit without warning. Jorlik and Callan were in the field, collecting data on the planet's first native pollinators to emerge since the restoration began. A distant rumble caught Jorlik's attention, his antennae quivering in alarm. The clouds above, which had been scattered and benign, were now coalescing into ominous gray masses. Storm systems are developing at an abnormal rate, Jorlik said, his voice tight with concern. He pointed to his portable scanner, which displayed sharp spikes in atmospheric pressure. This level of instability is unnatural. The hydrological cycle is overcompensating. Callan shielded his eyes and looked up at the roiling sky. So, what, it's just rain, right? Might even help things grow. Jorlik shot him a glare. This is not just rain. The temperature differentials are extreme. If my calculations are correct, we are about to experience a deafening crack of thunder split the air, followed by a gale-force wind that ripped across the landscape. A hyperstorm, Jorlik finished, his words nearly lost in the howl of the wind. The two scrambled for shelter, huddling beneath the rocky overhang as the storm unleashed its fury. Sheets of rain lashed the ground, turning the soil into a muddy torrent that carried debris into the newly formed rivers. Lightning flashed in rapid succession, illuminating the forest in stark, jagged bursts. "This is bad," Jorlik muttered, clutching his scanner. "If the storm destabilizes the riverbanks, it could cause flooding downstream. The wetlands will bounce back, Callan interrupted, though his usual bravado was strained. This planet's tougher than you think, Doc. Yorlik gave him a withering look. Resilience does not negate vulnerability. If the storm erodes the topsoil, it could set back the entire recovery effort by decades. Callan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he activated his comm device, summoning a fleet of drones from the photorin. Within minutes, the machines descended like a swarm of silver insects, spreading out across the landscape. "Relax," Callan said, his voice raised over the din of the storm. "The drones are programmed for flood mitigation. They'll reinforce the riverbanks and redirect runoff into the reservoirs we set up last month." Jurlik watched the drones at work, his skepticism warring with a begrudging sense of admiration. As the rain continued to pour, the machines tirelessly built barriers, dug drainage channels, and redistributed sediment to prevent erosion. By the time the storm subsided hours later, the damage had been minimized. The forest was battered but intact, and the rivers had avoided catastrophic flooding. Jorlik surveyed the aftermath, his fronds drooping in relief. "You were lucky," he said, his tone still sharp despite his gratitude. Callan grinned, wiping mud from his face. "Luck had nothing to do with it, that's just good planning." Jorlik raised an eyebrow. "Your definition of planning remains dubious." In the days that followed, the storm proved to be both a setback and a boon. While it had caused localized damage, the influx of water revitalized the wetlands and spurred an unexpected burst of growth. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, their vivid colors attracting pollinators in droves. For the first time, Jorlik allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. The planet, against all odds, seemed to be adapting. But his optimism was short-lived. The next crisis emerged in the form of the apex predator Callan had introduced weeks earlier, the Pantheroid Plus. At first, the genetically modified creature had performed as intended, keeping smaller predators and herbivores in check. Its sleek, powerful form had become a symbol of the ecosystem's resilience. Now, a critical test must begin. How far would a creature's skills go? Until it started hunting out of pattern. Jorlik discovered the anomaly during a routine survey of the forest. The remains of several grazers lay scattered across a clearing, their bodies bearing the unmistakable claw marks of the pantheroid. "This is troubling," Jorlik said, examining the tracks. "The creature is exhibiting signs of overpredation. It is killing far more than it can consume." Callan crouched beside the tracks, his brow furrowed. "That's weird. The genetic programming was supposed to limit its hunting behavior. Maybe something's throwing it off." "Perhaps your programming was insufficiently robust," Jorlik said, his tone icy. Callan sighed. "All right, Doc. Point taken. I'll recalibrate the controls. Shouldn't be too hard to—" A low guttural growl interrupted him. Both men froze, their eyes snapping toward the tree line. The pantheroid stepped into view, its glowing eyes locked onto them. Doc," Callan said slowly, you might want to start backing up." Jorlik did not need to be told twice. The two retreated cautiously as the pantheroid advanced, its movements fluid and predatory. "It is displaying territorial behavior," Jorlik whispered, his fronds trembling. "This should not be possible." "Yeah, well, it is," Callan muttered, activating his wrist controller. He tapped a series of commands, his jaw tightening as the pantheroid continued to close the distance. "What are you doing?" Jorlik demanded. "Shutting it down," Callan said. "Just give me a second." The pantheroid growled again, its muscles tensing for a lunge. "Callan! Callan!" Jorlik hissed, panic rising in his voice. "Got it!" Callan shouted, just as the pantheroid leapt. The creature froze mid-air, its body locking into place as the control override took effect. It collapsed to the ground, its limbs rigid. Jorlik stared at the immobilized predator, his fronds quivering. That was entirely too close. Callan exhaled heavily, wiping sweat from his brow. No kidding. I'll fix its programming back at the lab. Shouldn't happen again. Jorlik glared at him. It must not happen again. Your reckless creations are a threat not only to this ecosystem, but to us as well. Callan raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll tighten the screws. But hey, at least we know it's good at its job. Jorlik groaned, his fronds drooping. You are incorrigible. Despite the challenges, Narphex VII's recovery continued. The planet's atmosphere reached near optimal levels, its ecosystems displaying signs of self-sufficiency. But Jorlik remained vigilant, knowing that the line between progress and disaster was thinner than Callan seemed to realize. Every triumph seems to be accompanied by a new crisis, Jorlik said one evening, as they stood on a ridge overlooking the thriving landscape. Sure, Callan replied, tossing a pebble into the river below. That's just how it goes. Progress isn't perfect, Doc. It's messy. Jorlik glanced at him, his fronds swaying thoughtfully. And yet you persist. Callan grinned. It's kind of our thing. Jorlik turned back to the horizon, his gaze lingering on the vibrant greens and blues of the reborn planet. For all his misgivings, he could not deny the results. Perhaps, just perhaps, Callan's chaos had its place after all. The following months were a delicate balancing act. Narphex VII was no longer merely surviving. It was thriving. The forests had matured into sprawling ecosystems, the rivers teemed with fish, and the atmosphere approached pre-catastrophe stability. Jorlik and Callan had shifted their focus from active intervention to meticulous monitoring, watching as the planet began to regulate itself. Yet, as the ecosystem grew in complexity, so too did its challenges. One afternoon, Jorlik stood on a ridge, his scanner buzzing softly as he cataloged the nutrient cycles of the valley below. Beside him, Callan chewed absent-mindedly on a piece of dehydrated fruit, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Everything's looking pretty good, huh? Callan said, breaking the silence. At a glance, Jorlik replied, his voice tinged with caution. But we cannot afford to become complacent. The system remains fragile. Even a minor imbalance could spiral out of control. Doc, you've been saying that for months, Callan said, grinning, and yet here we are. Look at this place. It's a paradise. Jorlik didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his scanner, narrowing his focus on a patch of wetlands at the base of the valley. The water shimmered with an odd sheen, its surface reflecting light in unnatural patterns. This is troubling, Jorlik murmured, crouching to study his readings more closely. What's up? Callan asked, peering over his shoulder. There is an anomaly in the wetlands, Jorlik said, his antennae twitching. The water is exhibiting signs of eutrophication, an excess of nutrients leading to algal blooms. If left unchecked, it could suffocate aquatic life and destabilize the food chain. Callan frowned. That doesn't make sense. The nutrient levels were fine last week. Something has changed, Jorlik said, rising to his feet. We must investigate immediately. When they reached the wetlands, the extent of the problem became clear. Thick mats of algae covered the water's surface, their green tendrils choking out sunlight and leaving the water beneath dark and lifeless. Fish carcasses floated in stagnant pools, their scales dulled by decay. This is catastrophic, Jorlik said, his fronds wilting. "If the algae continue to spread, they will disrupt the entire aquatic ecosystem." "All right, don't panic," Callan said, pulling out his data pad. "We'll handle this. Just need to figure out what's feeding the bloom." He tapped furiously on the device, cross-refurbishing data from their drones and sensors. After a few moments, he let out a low whistle. "Found it," he said, turning the data pad toward Yorlik. "Looks like one of the aquifers we reactivated is dumping excess minerals into the wetlands. It's basically a nutrient fire hose." Jorlik's fronds bristled. "And how do you propose we stop it? The aquifer is an essential part of the planet's hydrological cycle." "We don't stop it," Callan said. "We redirect it." "Redirect it?" Yorlik echoed, incredulous. "Yeah," Callan said, already pulling up schematics. "We'll use the drones to divert some of the flow into dry basins. Spread the nutrients out instead of concentrating them here. It'll slow the bloom and give the wetlands a chance to recover." Yorlik hesitated, his antennae twitching as he considered the plan. "It is risky. Altering the water distribution could have unforeseeable consequences." Callan gave him a lopsided grin. "When has that ever stopped us?" The operation to redirect the aquifer was one of their most complex yet. Dozens of drones worked in tandem, excavating channels and constructing barriers to control the flow of water. Yorlik monitored every detail with meticulous care, while Callan improvised adjustments on the fly, his boundless energy keeping the team motivated. After days of relentless effort, the plan succeeded. The algal bloom began to recede, and the wetlands showed signs of recovery. New fish populations emerged, and the water's clarity improved as the balance slowly returned. Jorlik stood by the water's edge, watching a heron-like bird wade through the shallows. Its long beak darted into the water, emerging with a wriggling fish. "It seems your plan has worked," Jorlik admitted, though his tone remained guarded. "See? Told you," Callan said, plopping down on a nearby rock. "Humans may not have it all figured out, but we're pretty good at winging it." Yorlik sighed, his fronds swaying in the breeze. "Your methods are infuriatingly imprecise, but I cannot deny their effectiveness. This planet owes its revival to your chaotic ingenuity." "And your careful oversight," Callan added, giving him a genuine smile. Yorlik blinked in surprise, unaccustomed to receiving such straightforward praise. "Perhaps our approaches are more complementary than I had anticipated." With the wetlands stabilized, Narphex VII entered a new phase of recovery. The ecosystem became increasingly self-sustaining, its cycles of growth and decay beginning to regulate themselves. Even Yorlik, ever the skeptic, began to relax. But not completely. One evening, as they prepared to leave the planet for an extended observation period, Yorlik stood on a hill overlooking the vibrant landscape. Callan joined him, his usual grin replaced by a more contemplative expression. "Hard to believe this place was a wasteland when we got here," Callan said. "Indeed," Yorlik replied. "The transformation is nothing short of miraculous." Callan turned to him. "So what happens now?" "No, we observe," Jorlik said. "The ecosystem must prove it can sustain itself without further intervention. If it succeeds, Narphex VII will become a beacon of hope for ecological restoration efforts across the galaxy." "And if it doesn't?" Urlik's fronds droop slightly. "Then we will have learned valuable lessons, albeit at great cost." Callan nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "You know, Doc, for all your doom and gloom talk, you've got a lot of faith in this place." Jorlik hesitated, then nodded. Perhaps, I have come to believe in something more unexpected." "What's that?" Callan asked. "You," Jorlik said simply. Callan blinked, caught off guard. Me? You embody a chaotic resilience that defies logic, Jorlik said. It is both infuriating and strangely inspiring. Callan laughed. Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment. Jorlik's fronds swayed in amusement. It was intended as one. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the planet in a warm golden glow, the two stood in silence, their partnership now one of mutual respect and admiration. Narphex VII was no longer just a mission. It was a testament to what could be achieved when two vastly different perspectives worked toward a common goal. The Photozen drifted silently in orbit as Callan and Jorlik completed their final preparations to leave Narphex VII. The planet below had transformed into a vibrant oasis, teeming with life, its once barren surface now a patchwork of lush greenery, flowing rivers, and thriving ecosystems. For the first time in its recorded history, the planet was stable and beautiful. But as they reviewed their findings aboard the ship, both men remained on edge. Nature, though resilient, was unpredictable. It was during their first observation cycle, weeks after their departure, that a troubling anomaly surfaced. Jorlik had been poring over satellite imagery and atmospheric data when he noticed a sharp uptick in carbon dioxide levels. "This is not possible," he muttered, his fronds twitching as he cross-referenced the data. "The forest cover should be sufficient to offset emissions. Something must be wrong." "More storms?" Callan asked, walking into the lab with a steaming cup of coffee. "No," Jorlik said, pointing to the display. "This is not atmospheric. It is terrestrial. Look here, several regions are emitting carbon dioxide at alarming rates." Callan leaned in, his brow furrowing. "That's coming from underground." "Precisely," Jorlik said. "The reactivation of the aquifers must have disturbed dormant geothermal vents. If this continues, it could trigger a greenhouse effect, undoing everything we have achieved." Callan set his coffee down, his expression grim. "All right. What's the plan?" Jorlik hesitated. "We must return to the surface and assess the situation directly. If the geothermal activity cannot be mitigated, the planet may become uninhabitable once more." Callan gave him a determined nod. "Then let's suit up." Back on the planet's surface, the contrast between its beauty and the looming threat was stark. Verdant forests stretched for miles, their canopies alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of wind. Yet the air carried an unusual heaviness, a subtle but undeniable warning of the changes occurring beneath the ground. Jorlik and Callan set up monitoring stations near one of the hotspots, where cracks in the earth emitted faint wisps of gas. The readings were sobering. "This vent is releasing methane in addition to carbon dioxide," Jorlik said, his tone grim. "If these emissions are widespread, they could destabilize the atmosphere within months." "Any ideas?" Callan asked, his arms crossed as he studied the scanner. Jorlik hesitated. "One possibility is to redirect the geothermal energy. If we can harness it for planetary cooling, it could offset the emissions and stabilize the climate." "Redirect it how?" "We would need to drill channels to vent the gases into a reservoir where they can be converted into less harmful compounds," Jorlik explained. "It is a delicate process, but it has been done on smaller scales." Callan grinned. "Delicate processes are my specialty." Jorlik gave him a sidelong look. "That is not remotely true." "Fair," Callan admitted. "But we're doing it anyway. Let's get to work." The drilling operation was the most ambitious undertaking of their mission. Drones equipped with precision tools carved channels into the earth, while specialized converters, designed by Callan, were installed to capture and neutralize the emissions. The work was slow and painstaking. Jorlik supervised every step, his fronds tense with anxiety, while Callan's unflappable energy kept the team motivated. As the days stretched into weeks, the results began to show. The converters successfully reduced the gas output, and the atmosphere started to stabilize. The planet's temperature fluctuations eased, and the forests, though stressed, showed no signs of decline. Jorlik allowed himself a rare moment of relief. It appears the worst has been averted. The geothermal emissions are now within manageable levels. "Told you we'd figure it out," Callan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "And we didn't even blow anything up this time." Jorlik gave him a stern look. "That is not the standard by which we should measure success." Callan laughed. "Fair enough, but admit it, Doc, we make a pretty good team." Jorlik hesitated, then nodded. "Despite your infuriating methods, I must concede that your contributions have been invaluable." Callan beamed. "High praise coming from you." With the geothermal crisis resolved, Narphex VII entered what Jorlik hoped would be its final phase of recovery. The planet's ecosystems continued to evolve, finding balance in ways that even Jorlik's models had not predicted. One evening, as they prepared to leave the planet for the last time, Jorlik and Callan stood together on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. "It is remarkable," Jorlik said softly, "what we have accomplished here. It defies logic." "Logic's overrated," Callan replied, smiling. Jorlik turned to him, his fronds swaying in the gentle breeze. "Perhaps, but it is not logic that will be remembered here. It is resilience, both of the planet and of those who dared to restore it." Callan clapped him on the shoulder. "Well said, Doc. Think the galaxy's ready for our success story?" Jorlik's gaze lingered on the vibrant, living world before them. "I believe the galaxy will be astounded, and perhaps, for once, they will not underestimate humanity's chaotic brilliance." As the two boarded the Phytowind for the final time, Narphex VII stood as a testament to the impossible, a dead world brought back to life, not by perfect plans, but by a partnership that embraced both logic and chaos. And as the ship soared into the stars, leaving the planet to flourish on its own, Jorlik found himself quietly grateful for the maddening, miraculous human who had made it all possible.